In the winter of 1929, in a narrow excavation trench near the ancient city of Ur in southern Iraq, archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, directing the joint expedition of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, encountered something unexpected. The dig had already yielded remarkable treasures from the royal cemetery: golden helmets, lapis lazuli jewellery, the remains of servants who had accompanied their monarchs into death. But what Woolley found in that trench would raise questions that remain unanswered to this day. Beneath the layers of the Sumerian city, beneath the tombs of kings who ruled 4,000 years ago, beneath even the earliest foundations of human habitation at the site, there was a stratum of clean, water-deposited clay. No artefacts, no pottery sherds, no evidence of human activity whatsoever, just clay, approximately 8 to 11 feet of it, laid down by flooding waters in the distant past. And beneath that sterile layer, there was something else, entirely. Different pottery, different styles, different people. Woolley would later interpret this flood layer as evidence of a biblical deluge, though subsequent analysis has demonstrated multiple flooding episodes rather than a single catastrophic event. But the deeper implication of his discovery remains profoundly unsettling. The people who lived at Ur before the flood were not the same people who lived there afterward. Something had happened. Something had ended one way of life and made room for another. The excavation records from Ur, now housed in the archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the British Museum, document this discontinuity with meticulous precision. Pottery styles change abruptly across the flood boundary. Architectural traditions shift. The very way humans organise their lives underwent fundamental transformation. Woolley and his team had uncovered not merely evidence of flooding, but evidence of civilizational succession, one world ending, another beginning. This pattern, archaeologists have since discovered, repeats throughout the deep history of the Near East and indeed across the globe. Not once, not twice, but multiple times human-made civilizations have risen, flourished, and then fallen, destroyed by forces that the survivors could barely comprehend and that we, their distant descendants, are only now beginning to understand. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents known to humanity, explicitly acknowledges this cyclical pattern. It speaks of kingship descending from heaven, of antediluvian rulers who governed for impossibly long periods, of catastrophic floods that reset the course of human history. And when the modern archaeological record is examined with appropriate rigour, something remarkable emerges. The mythological pattern and the physical evidence align more closely than conventional scholarship once assumed. We find ourselves, according to this analysis, in the 7th iteration of human civilization. 6 previous cycles have risen and fallen before us. Each was destroyed by a different catastrophe. Each left survivors who carried fragments of knowledge into the next age. And each destruction event has left physical evidence that modern science can detect, analyse, and date with increasing precision. Understanding what destroyed the 6 civilizations that preceded us may be essential to determining whether we, the 7th, will survive. The first catastrophe, according to one interpretation of the evidence, came from the sky. Approximately 12,800 years ago, as the last ice age was finally releasing its grip on the northern hemisphere, something changed with devastating suddenness. The geological record from this period, documented across multiple continents and confirmed by independent research teams at institutions including the University of California, Santa Barbara, the South Carolina Research Authority, and Arizona State University, reveals a distinct boundary layer, a thin stratum of material that marks a moment of extreme environmental disruption. This boundary layer, often referred to as the Younger Dryas boundary or the black mat, contains materials that some researchers argue have no explanation in conventional geological processes, though this interpretation remains the subject of ongoing scientific debate. Nanodiamonds, microscopic carbon crystals that form only under conditions of extreme pressure and temperature, appear at this boundary in concentrations that proponents of the impact hypothesis consider far exceeding normal background levels. Researchers led by Douglas Kennett of Pennsylvania State University, publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2009, documented the presence of these nanodiamonds at multiple sites across North America, from Murray Springs in Arizona to Bull Creek in Oklahoma to Lake Hind in Manitoba. However, subsequent studies by independent researchers have challenged some of these findings, with some scientists identifying the particles as misidentified graphene or terrestrial formations rather than impact markers. The significance of these nanodiamonds, if the impact interpretation proves correct, could not be overstated. In nature, such particles form under only a few circumstances, deep within the Earth's mantle, in the heart of collapsing stars, or in the catastrophic violence of cosmic impacts. Proponents argue that the fact they appear simultaneously across a continent-spanning boundary layer, in association with other potential impact markers, including magnetic spherules, melted glass, and elevated platinum group element concentrations, suggests an event of extraordinary magnitude. Critics, however, point to studies demonstrating that similar nanodiamonds can form in ordinary wildfires and that the dating of these materials may not be as synchronous as initially claimed. Additional evidence from this period includes what researchers have termed the black mat itself, a dark carbon-rich layer that covers many late Pleistocene archaeological sites across North America. C. Vance Haynes Jr., publishing data in 2008, documented the synchronous nature of these black mat deposits across dozens of Clovis-era archaeological sites. His conclusion, while remaining skeptical of the impact hypothesis, acknowledged that something major happened at 10 to 900 years before present that we have yet to understand. This cautious assessment reflects the scientific community's divided opinion on the hypothesis. Some researchers finding the impact evidence compelling, others attributing the same markers to terrestrial processes, or questioning the methodology of impact proponents. The consequences of this event were catastrophic. The Younger Dryas cooling episode, which began precisely at this boundary, saw temperatures across the northern hemisphere plunge by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a span of decades, essentially overnight in geological terms. The warming trend that had characterized the post-glacial period reversed abruptly. Ice sheets that had been retreating began advancing again. Ecosystems that had adapted to warming conditions were thrown into crisis. The megafauna of North America, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American horses, camels and dozens of other large animal species, disappeared from the fossil record within a few centuries of this boundary. The Clovis culture, the first well-documented human presence in the Americas, vanishes from the archaeological record at essentially the same moment. Something had disrupted not just the climate, but the entire ecological foundation upon which human existence depended. Research conducted at the archaeological site of Abu Huraira in Syria, published in Scientific Reports in 2020, presented additional evidence that proponents argue supports this catastrophic event hypothesis. Melt glass, nanodiamonds, and other potential impact proxies were recovered from sediment layers dating to approximately 12,800 years before present, the same period identified in North American sites. The melt glass, according to the researchers' analysis, formed at temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Celsius, potentially reaching temperatures above what would be expected from simple campfires or lightning strikes. The glass was found in association with bone fragments, clay building plaster, and stone tool debitage, which the researchers interpret as suggesting the village experienced whatever produced these extreme temperatures directly. This interpretation, like much of the impact hypothesis evidence, remains debated within the scientific community, with some researchers proposing alternative explanations for the high-temperature materials. The implications of this evidence, if the impact hypothesis gains further support, could be profound. A civilization of hunter-gatherers, possessed of sophisticated stone tool technology, astronomical knowledge sufficient to align structures to celestial phenomena, and the organizational capacity to construct monuments such as Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, may have existed before this proposed catastrophe, and then, in geological terms, perhaps instantaneously, that world may have ended. The extent to which such a cosmic event would have disrupted human societies, and whether such an event occurred at all, continues to be investigated through ongoing archaeological and geological research. What survived? Small scattered groups who fled to sheltered locations, populations who happened to be in regions less directly affected, individuals whose skills and knowledge proved useful in the radically changed environment that followed. These survivors carried memories of the destruction with them, memories that would eventually crystallize into the flood myths, fire from heaven narratives, and tales of catastrophic, World endings that appear in the mythologies of cultures across the globe. The construction of Göbekli Tepe, which radiocarbon dating conducted by the German Archaeological Institute places between approximately 9500 and 8000 BCE, began in the period following the Younger Dryas climatic disruption. This timing appears significant to some researchers. The site, with its sophisticated astronomical alignments, its massive T-shaped pillars carved with symbolic imagery, and its deliberate burial around 8000 BCE, may represent an attempt by its builders to encode critical knowledge in stone, knowledge that might survive whatever challenges came next. This interpretation, while speculative, draws on the site's remarkable preservation and the apparent deliberateness with which it was interred. If the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, the first civilization, understood as an organised pre-agricultural society of some sophistication, was destroyed by fire from the sky. Those who survived may have built monuments to preserve knowledge and warn their descendants, and then the second major disruption came. But before we proceed to the drowning world, we must pause to consider what kind of society might have existed before that climatic disruption. The evidence, though fragmentary, suggests something more sophisticated than simple hunter-gatherer bands. Göbekli Tepe itself presents profound archaeological puzzles. The site contains at least 20 circular enclosures, of which only a fraction have been excavated despite decades of work by teams from the German Archaeological Institute. The largest pillars weigh between 10 and 20 tons, carved from limestone bedrock and transported to the hilltop site without benefit of metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals. The carvings on these pillars, foxes, snakes, scorpions, wild boar, aurochs, and enigmatic humanoid figures, demonstrate artistic sophistication and symbolic complexity that have led researchers to reconsider assumptions about the capabilities of pre-agricultural societies. The site's original excavator, Klaus Schmidt, who directed work there from 1995 until his death in 2014, described Göbekli Tepe as representing something like a sanctuary of the Stone Age. The labour required to quarry, transport, carve and erect these monuments implies a workforce of hundreds, sustained over periods of years or decades. Such coordination typically requires agricultural surplus, food supplies that free workers from subsistence activities. Yet the archaeological evidence from the site's early construction phases shows no clear evidence of domesticated plants or animals. This apparent paradox has led some researchers to propose a reversal of the conventional understanding of the Neolithic revolution. Perhaps they suggest it was not agriculture that enabled monument building, but the desire to build monuments that incentivize the development of agriculture. Populations gathered at sacred sites like Göbekli Tepe might have exhausted local wild resources, forcing them to begin cultivating plants and managing animal populations to sustain the labour force required for their religious constructions. Whether or not this hypothesis proves correct, the existence of Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that human populations possessed organisational capabilities far exceeding what conventional models would predict for the period following the Younger Dryas climatic disruption. These capabilities must have developed over time through processes that archaeologists are still working to understand. Our researchers have suggested that if the builders of Göbekli Tepe were inheritors of earlier cultural traditions disrupted by environmental changes, their construction of the site makes considerable sense. Perhaps an attempt to preserve knowledge, to honour the dead, or to mark a sacred space where contact with the divine might be maintained. Such interpretations, while not provable from the current archaeological evidence, offer one framework for understanding this remarkable site. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BCE adds another layer of mystery to the site. The enclosures were carefully filled with soil and debris, preserving the structures remarkably well for archaeologists to discover 11 millennia later. Why would a population go to such effort to bury a site they had laboured for generations to construct? One possibility is that the site had served its purpose, whatever knowledge it was meant to preserve had been transmitted, whatever rituals it housed had been completed. Another possibility is that conditions had changed in ways that made the site's continued use impossible or undesirable, perhaps environmental shifts or changes in social organisation. A third possibility, more speculative but worth considering, is that the builders wished to protect their work from deterioration or destruction. The evidence does not permit definitive conclusions about the motivations behind this unusual treatment of a sacred site. The emergence of agriculture in the millennia following Göbekli Tepe's construction and burial transformed human society in ways that would eventually enable the civilizations of historical antiquity. Yet this transformation may itself have been shaped by the memory of environmental disruption. Flood myths, fire from heaven narratives, and tales of destroyed predecessor civilizations pervade the mythologies of early agricultural peoples. These stories may represent not mere psychological projections, but genuine cultural memories of catastrophic events, memories preserved through oral tradition across thousands of years. The extent to which such myths correspond to actual historical events, or whether they arise from universal human psychological responses to localized disasters, remains an open question in comparative mythology and archaeology. If the catastrophe scenario suggested by impact hypothesis proponents reflects historical reality, the survivors of that first destruction built the foundations upon which subsequent civilizations would rise. Their genetic heritage flows in our veins. Their astronomical observations, potentially encoded in monument alignments and later mythological traditions, may inform our calendars. Their linguistic innovations gave rise to language families that encompass billions of modern speakers. In ways direct and indirect, we would be their descendants, the latest generation of a lineage that has persisted through catastrophe after catastrophe. The extent to which this narrative accurately describes early human history continues to be investigated through ongoing research in archaeology, genetics, and climate science. The oceans rose. This statement, in its simplicity, fails to convey the magnitude of what occurred in the millennia following the Younger Dryas impact. As the climate eventually restabilized and warming resumed, the vast ice sheets that had covered much of North America and northern Eurasia began to melt. The water they released had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was the ocean. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels stood roughly 120 meters below their present position. The continental shelves that today lie submerged beneath shallow coastal waters were exposed. Dry land, often well watered by rivers flowing from glacial meltwater sources, frequently featuring fertile soils ideal for human habitation. Archaeological evidence suggests that these coastal plains, now drowned beneath the waves, were among the most densely populated regions of the prehistoric world. Consider the geography of the Ice Age world. With so much waterlocked in continental ice sheets, the coastlines extended far beyond their present positions. The English Channel was dry land, a plain across which herds of mammoth and wild horse roamed, and through which early modern humans migrated from continental Europe to Britain. The North Sea was Dogsland, a low-lying region of marshes, rivers, and lakes that supported substantial hunter-gatherer populations. The Persian Gulf was entirely absent, replaced by a river valley through which the combined waters of the Tigris and Euphrates flowed to reach the Indian Ocean far south of their present mouths. In Southeast Asia, the landmass of Sundaland connected the modern islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines into a continental extension of mainland Asia. The Java Sea, the South China Sea, and significant portions of the Gulf of Thailand did not exist as bodies of water, but as river valleys, coastal plains, and forested lowlands. The total land area lost to post-glacial sea level rise in this region alone exceeds 1.8 million square kilometres, an area larger than modern-day Iran. The archaeological implications of these submerged landscapes are profound but largely unexplored. Marine archaeology in shallow coastal waters has documented numerous sites, submerged, forests, stone tool scatters, the remains of human settlements preserved beneath sediments on the continental shelf. Off the coast of Britain, the Doggerland project led by researchers at the University of Bradford has mapped an extensive landscape of former river channels, lake basins and potential human habitation sites now lying beneath 40 metres of North Sea water. Trawler nets regularly bring up artefacts from these drowned lands, carved bone, worked flint, and occasionally human remains. Yet systematic archaeology of these submerged regions remains in its infancy. The costs and technical challenges of underwater excavation limit the scope of investigation. Much of what we might learn about the peoples who lived on these now flooded lands remains hidden beneath waters that archaeology cannot yet penetrate. What we do know suggests that these were not marginal environments occupied by struggling populations, but rather prime territories supporting some of the densest human populations of the post-glacial world. Coastal zones offer exceptional resource diversity. Marine fisheries provide protein-rich food sources that require less territory per capita than terrestrial hunting. Estuaries and tidal flats support abundant shellfish populations that can be harvested with minimal technology. River mouths provide access to anadromous fish species, salmon, shad, sturgeon, that concentrate in predictable locations during spawning runs. The intersection of marine freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems creates opportunities for resource scheduling that can support sedentary or semi-sedentary populations without formal agriculture. If, as seems plausible based on the general pattern of coastal settlement throughout human history, some of the most sophisticated and densely populated human societies of the immediate post-glacial period occupied these coastal environments, then the archaeological record of this period may be fundamentally incomplete. The ancestors of the Ubaid people who appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 5500 BCE may have carried cultural traditions from regions now submerged beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. Their apparent sudden appearance in the archaeological record may represent not a cultural emergence from nothing, but rather a cultural retreat. Populations moving inland as rising waters claimed their original territories, bringing with them accumulated knowledge and traditions. The flood myths that pervade global cultures may preserve memories of this experience. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature known to humanity, contains the story of Utnapishtim, a wise man warned by the gods of an impending deluge, who built a boat to save his family and the seed of all living creatures from the rising waters. The obvious parallels to the biblical Noah story, itself derived from Mesopotamian antecedents, suggest that these narratives preserve cultural memories of genuine historical experience with catastrophic flooding. But the flood that these stories describe was not a single event lasting 40 days or even a year. It was a process spanning millennia, a generational drowning that would have seemed not so much like a discrete catastrophe as like an inexorable curse, a slow-motion punishment that consumed more of the familiar world with each passing century. Some meltwater pulses may have been rapid enough to be perceived within individual lifetimes, but the overall process extended across hundreds of human generations. This temporal extension actually strengthens rather than weakens the case for flood myths as cultural memory. A single sudden event, however traumatic, would leave fewer survivors and less opportunity for the development of elaborated narrative traditions. A gradual process, by contrast, would allow communities to observe the advancing waters, to debate their causes, to develop ritual responses, and to transmit stories about the phenomenon across multiple generations before the final displacement forced migration to higher ground. The Sumerian tradition of antediluvian kings ruling from cities with names like Eridu, Bad Tibra, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, cities that supposedly existed before the flood, but whose archaeological remains date to periods after conventional estimates for the maximum marine transgression, may preserve memory not of literal cities built and then destroyed, but of cultural continuity across the flooding event. The cities of the antediluvian period may have been the communities that inhabited the now submerged coastal plains, remembered and mythologized by their descendants who settled in the Mesopotamian lowlands after the waters finally stabilized. The sea level rise that followed deglaciation was not gradual and steady. It occurred in pulses, sudden accelerations during which water levels might jump meters within centuries, or even down decades. NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies has documented these meltwater pulses through analysis of coral reef sequences from Barbados, Tahiti, and the Great Barrier Reef. The most dramatic of these events, designated Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred between approximately 14,600 and 1,300 years ago, when global sea levels rose between 16 and 25 meters in roughly 400 years, a rate of rise that would have been perceptible within a human lifetime. Imagine the experience of coastal communities during such an event. Familiar landmarks disappearing beneath the waves, fishing grounds shifting then vanishing entirely, sacred sites, burial grounds, the places where ancestors had lived for generations, all slowly, inexorably claimed by the advancing sea. The Persian Gulf, which was entirely dry land during the glacial maximum, with the combined Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowing through its centre to reach the sea far beyond the present Strait of Hormuz, began flooding around 14,000 years ago. By 6000 BCE, this process was essentially complete, and that the familiar outline of the modern Gulf had taken shape. The implications for human populations are suggested by the Ubaid culture, which appears suddenly in the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia around 5500 BCE. This culture, identified by British archaeologist H.R. Hall through excavations at Tel al-Ubaid beginning in 1919, possessed sophisticated pottery traditions, advanced architectural techniques and agricultural practices that seem to arrive fully formed. The site of Eridu, traditionally regarded as the oldest city of Sumer, contains 17 temples built successively one atop another, with the earliest dating to approximately 5400 BCE. Each temple follows the same plan, the same orientation, as if preserving a template handed down across generations from an earlier time. Where did the Ubaid people come from? The archaeological record offers tantalizing hints. Their pottery styles show no clear local antecedents. Their architectural traditions appear without gradual development. The most parsimonious explanation may be that they were refugees, descendants of coastal populations displaced by rising seas, bringing with them the accumulated knowledge of civilizations now submerged beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. Similar patterns appear across the globe. The flooding of Doggerland, the landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe, displaced populations who left archaeological traces as they retreated to higher ground. The submersion of Sunderland, the vast lowland plain that connected Southeast Asia's island archipelagos during the glacial period, may have triggered migrations that shaped the ethnic composition of the entire Pacific region. Submerged structures reported off the coasts of India, Japan and the Mediterranean continue to fuel speculation about what civilization might have existed on these now drowned coastal plains. The second civilization, if such a distinct cultural configuration existed on the now submerged coastal plains, was transformed by water, not by a sudden flood, but by a relentless generational drowning that consumed the most fertile and accessible lands on Earth and forced surviving populations into marginal territories where they would have to rebuild from foundations laid by their ancestors. The climate then betrayed those who had survived fire and flood. Approximately 8,200 years ago, the climate system of the North Atlantic underwent a sudden and severe disruption. Ice cores from Greenland, analysed by researchers at the National Science Foundation Ice Core Laboratory and the University of Copenhagen's Centre for Ice and Climate, record a temperature drop of several degrees Celsius occurring within decades. Tree ring records from across Europe and North America show evidence of cold stress and disrupted growing seasons. Lake sediments from the Near East, Africa, and Asia document severe drought conditions that persisted for centuries. This event, known as the 8.2 kiloyear event, appears to have been triggered by the catastrophic drainage of glacial lakes Agassiz and Ojibwe in North America. These lakes, formed by meltwater ponding behind retreating ice sheets, contained volumes of fresh water roughly equivalent to the modern-day Great Lakes combined. When the ice dam holding them finally broke, this enormous volume of cold fresh water poured into the North Atlantic through Hudson Bay, disrupting the ocean circulation patterns that transport heat from equatorial regions toward the poles. The consequences for human civilization were severe. Archaeological records from the Near East, documented in publications including the journal Quaternary International and the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, show widespread site abandonment during this period. The pre-pottery Neolithic bee culture, which had flourished across the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia, effectively collapsed. Major population centres including Ain Ghazal in Jordan, Çatalhöyük in Turkey, and Abu Huraira in Syria show evidence of severe disruption, reduced population densities, changes in subsistence strategies, abandonment of previously occupied areas. Research conducted at Çatalhöyük and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2018 by Melanie Roffit-Salquay and colleagues provides particularly compelling evidence. Analysis of fatty residues preserved on pottery sherds from the site revealed elevated deuterium to hydrogen ratios during the 8.2 kiloyear event period, a chemical signature indicating reduced rainfall and intensified drought conditions. The archaeological record from the same layers shows evidence of dietary stress, with populations shifting toward different animal protein sources as their traditional food supplies became unreliable. The implications extend beyond the Near East. Research in the journal Nature Communications documents population decline and cultural disruption across Europe during this period. Western Scotland shows evidence of dramatic Mesolithic population reduction. Alpine lake records indicate the expansion of boreal vegetation at the expense of deciduous forests. The Iberian Peninsula experienced increased fire frequency and the expansion of fire-resistant oak species, signatures of prolonged summer drought. The third civilization, if we accept this framework of counting major cultural disruptions, was transformed not by fire from above or water from below, but by the failure of the seasonal patterns upon which agricultural societies depend. The rains did not come, the rivers ran low, the crops failed, and those who survived did so by fleeing to areas where reliable water sources, major rivers, permanent springs, could sustain reduced populations through the crisis. The pre-pottery, Neolithic period represents a remarkable chapter in human achievement, one that is only now beginning to receive appropriate recognition from archaeologists and historians. The settlements of this era, Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Ain Ghazal, Abu Huraira, Tel Aswad, represent the first experiments in dense, sedentary human habitation. Their populations numbered in the thousands. Their architectural achievements included multi-story structures and elaborate ceremonial spaces, and their artistic traditions produced works of sophistication and beauty that still command admiration. British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon, excavating at Jericho in the 1950s, established the basic framework for understanding this period that remains largely in use today. Her work revealed the famous Stone Tower of Jericho, a structure 8.5 meters tall and 9 meters in diameter, built around 8000 BCE and representing one of the earliest large-scale construction projects in human history. The purpose of this tower remains debated. Defense, astronomical observation, ritual function, and status display have all been proposed. Whatever its purpose, its construction required organized labor, coordinated planning, and the accumulation of surplus resources sufficient to free workers from subsistence activities, hallmarks of complex society. The site of Ain Ghazal in Jordan, excavated by Gary Rollifson and colleagues beginning in 1982, provides additional evidence for pre-pottery Neolithic sophistication. The site covered 15 hectares at its maximum extent and may have housed 3,000 or more inhabitants, a population density approaching that of small modern towns. The famous plaster statues recovered from Ain Ghazal, some standing nearly a metre tall, demonstrate artistic sophistication and ritual elaboration far exceeding what conventional models would predict for a pre-pottery society. Yet all of these achievements came crashing down around 6200 BCE. Radiocarbon. Dates from across the region show a clustering of site abandonments during this period. Ain Ghazal shrank dramatically before eventually being abandoned entirely. Çatalhöyük shifted in its settlement from the eastern to the western mound, accompanied by changes in architecture, economy, and social organization that suggest fundamental disruption. The great pre-pottery Neolithic experiment in urban living essentially ended, replaced by smaller, more dispersed settlements practicing different subsistence strategies. The mechanism linking the 8.2 kiloyear climate event to this archaeological pattern involves the fundamental constraints on rain-fed agriculture. The civilizations of the pre-pottery Neolithic depended primarily on rainfall for their crops. Unlike later Mesopotamian civilizations, which developed elaborate irrigation systems drawing on the Tigris and Euphrates, the PPNB settlements relied on precipitation falling directly on their fields and replenishing local groundwater sources. When the 8.2 kiloyear event reduced rainfall across the region by amounts estimated at 20 to 50%, these agricultural systems failed. The consequences cascaded through the social and economic systems that pre-pottery Neolithic communities had developed. Food shortages weakened populations and increased susceptibility to disease. Competition for remaining resources may have triggered conflict between communities that had previously coexisted peacefully. The elaborate ceremonial and artistic traditions that had flourished during times of abundance became impossible to maintain when populations were struggling for bare survival. Skills that had been specialized and passed down through generations were lost, as their practitioners died without training successors. The survivors of this catastrophe were not randomly distributed. Those who had access to permanent water sources, major rivers, reliable springs, lake margins, could continue agricultural production even as surrounding regions dried out. Those whose subsistence strategies included pastoral nomadism could move their herds to areas where rainfall remained sufficient for grazing. Those living in upland areas, where topography could capture precipitation that escaped lowland regions, maintained viable communities while their neighbours fled or perished. This differential survival shaped the subsequent trajectory of human civilization in the region. The concentration of population along major rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, that would characterize later millennia, may have been established not through gradual preference, but through catastrophic selection during the 8.2 kiloyear event. The survivors in these favoured locations carried forward the accumulated knowledge of the pre-pottery Neolithic, while their contemporaries in less fortunate regions vanished from the archaeological record. The contrast between the achievements of the pre-pottery Neolithic and the simpler societies that immediately followed the 8.2 kiloyear event is striking. Architecture became less elaborate, settlement sizes decreased, artistic traditions that had flourished for millennia disappeared or survived only in diminished form. The interruption was not permanent. Within a millennium, complex societies were again emerging in the Mesopotamian lowlands, but it represented a genuine civilizational setback from which recovery required generations. The fourth catastrophe came as the green world died. Between approximately 5,500 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara transformed from savanna to desert. This event, documented through lake sediment cores, pollen records, and archaeological surveys conducted by institutions including the German Archaeological Institute, the University of Toronto, and the Royal Ontario Museum, represents one of the most dramatic environmental transitions in the recent geological record. Regions that had supported lakes, rivers, diverse wildlife, and substantial human populations became within a span of centuries the hyper-arid wasteland we recognise today. The evidence for the Green Sahara period is extensive and unequivocal. Rock art found throughout the central Saharan massifs, the Tassili Nadja in Algeria, the Tadrat Akakus in Libya, the Tibesti and Enedi mountains of Chad, depicts scenes of cattle herding, hunting of large game animals, swimming in lakes, and other activities impossible in the current environment. Archaeological sites including Gabero in Niger, excavated by Paul Serino of the University of Chicago beginning in 2000, have yielded evidence of fishing communities living on the shores of substantial lakes during the Green Sahara period. The cemetery at Gabero, containing burials spanning thousands of years, provides direct evidence of the populations who lived and died in this now vanished landscape. What caused the Green Sahara to become the Sahara Desert? The primary driver appears to have been orbital, forcing the gradual shift in Earth's axial tilt that alters the distribution of solar energy between hemispheres. During the early and middle Holocene, this orbital configuration strengthened the African monsoon, bringing summer rains far north of their present position. As the orbital configuration continued to evolve, the monsoon weakened and the rains retreated southward. However, the transition was not simply gradual. Climate modelling suggests that vegetation-atmosphere feedbacks amplified the orbital signal, creating tipping points at which relatively small changes in precipitation could trigger rapid, cascading ecosystem collapse. Once vegetation cover declined below certain thresholds, reduced evapotranspiration further decreased local rainfall, accelerating the drying process. Research published in Nature Communications by Edward Armstrong and colleagues at the University of Helsinki and University of Bristol demonstrates that these dynamics can explain the apparently abrupt nature of the Sahara's transformation. For human populations, the consequences were catastrophic. Archaeological evidence documents massive population movements from the desiccating Sahara toward the Nile Valley, the highlands of Ethiopia, the Mediterranean coast, and the sub-Saharan savannas to the south. The sudden demographic pulse into the Nile Valley in the late 4th millennium BCE may have been a significant factor in the emergence of the unified Egyptian state. Populations carrying pastoral traditions, astronomical knowledge accumulated through generations of observing the night sky from desert vantage points, and social organizational patterns adapted to mobile herding lifestyles, entered regions that would become the cradles of later civilizations. The stone circle at Nabta Playa in the Egyptian Nubian desert, dated to approximately 7,000 years ago by radiocarbon analysis of associated organic materials, demonstrates the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of these Saharan populations. The alignment of stones to mark summer solstice sunrise, combined with evidence of cattle sacrifice and other ritual activities, suggests a complex society with organized religion and calendrical expertise. Yet by 5,000 years ago, Nabta Playa was abandoned. The water table had dropped too far, the pastures had disappeared, the people who built the monuments had moved on, carrying their knowledge with them to wherever the conditions still permitted life. The fourth civilization in this framework was transformed by drought, by the fundamental change of their entire biome from productive savanna into uninhabitable desert within just a few human generations. Those who survived fled to river valleys where irrigation could replace failed rainfall, and there they contributed to the emergence of the literate civilizations whose records form the earliest chapters of conventional history. The transformation of the Sahara from savanna to desert represents perhaps the most dramatic environmental change that human populations have witnessed during the Holocene epoch. The scale is almost incomprehensible: 9 million square kilometres, an area larger than the continental United States, transformed from productive grassland, scattered woodlands, and seasonal lakes into the largest hot desert on Earth. The human populations who had called this region home for millennia faced a choice: adapt, migrate, or perish. The archaeological record of the Green Sahara period documents a sophisticated pastoral civilization that left abundant evidence across what is now one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The rock art traditions of the central Saharan massifs, the Tassili Nadja, the Tadrat Akakus, the Tibesti and Enedi, mountains constitute one of the world's largest open-air galleries, containing tens of thousands of individual images spanning thousands of years of cultural development. The earliest images date to the late Pleistocene and depict the wild fauna of a wetter Sahara: elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, fish. The middle period shows the emergence of cattle pastoralism, with domestic cattle prominently featured alongside human figures in scenes of daily life, ceremonial activities, and what appear to be mythological narratives. The latest images document the progressive desiccation, showing horses and eventually camels replacing cattle as the region's climate became increasingly hostile to bovine husbandry. The site of Nabta Playa, investigated by Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University and Romuald Schild of the Polish Academy of Sciences beginning in 2004, provides particularly compelling evidence for the sophistication of Saharan pastoral societies. Located in the Egyptian Nubian Desert about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, the site contains archaeological deposits spanning thousands of years of occupation during wetter climatic phases. The most famous feature is a stone circle arrangement that appears to have been aligned to mark the summer solstice, evidence of astronomical observation and calendrical sophistication that predates the Egyptian civilization that would later become famous for such knowledge. The Nabta Playa complex also includes what may be the earliest known human-constructed astronomical alignments, predating Stonehenge by more than 2,000 years. 5 megalith alignments radiate outward from a central complex, their orientations corresponding to various astronomical phenomena, including the rise points of particular stars. Whether these alignments served practical purposes, marking seasonal transitions relevant to pastoral management, or religious ones, encoding mythological significance in the source, celestial sphere, or both remains debated. What is clear is that the populations who constructed them possessed knowledge and organizational capabilities far exceeding simple nomadic pastoralism. The desiccation of the Sahara did not occur uniformly across the region. Lake Chad, which at its maximum extent during the African humid period covered an area approaching 400,000 square kilometers, larger than the Caspian Sea today, shrank progressively as the monsoon weakened and evaporation exceeded precipitation. Other lakes, the Megachad, Megalake Fezan, Paleo Lake Achnet Moidir, dried up entirely, leaving behind the salt flats and dry lake beds that today constitute some of the Sahara's most dramatic landscapes. As the lakes dried and the pastures failed, human populations concentrated in areas where water remained available. The Nile Valley received a massive demographic pulse, as populations fleeing the desiccating Sahara converged on the one permanent water source in the region. Archaeological surveys have documented dramatic increases in Nile Valley settlement density during the late 4th millennium BCE, the period immediately preceding the emergence of unified Egyptian civilization. The contribution of Saharan refugees to Egyptian civilization has been debated since the early days of Egyptology. Some scholars argue for substantial population replacement, with incoming pastoral populations displacing or absorbing earlier Nile Valley inhabitants. Others see continuity of local populations supplemented by more modest numbers of immigrants. The genetic evidence, still being assembled through ancient DNA analysis, suggests a complex pattern of admixture rather than wholesale replacement. What seems clear is that Saharan populations brought with them knowledge and cultural traditions that influenced Egyptian development. The emphasis on cattle in early Egyptian religion, the sky goddess Nut sometimes depicted as a cow spanning the heavens, the importance of cattle in royal symbolism, The extensive cattle imagery and early rock art may derive from Saharan pastoral traditions. The astronomical knowledge embedded in pyramid alignments and temple orientations may trace ancestry to observations first made under the clear skies of the Saharan highlands. The social organisation patterns that enabled the construction of monuments may descend from the structures that Saharan pastoral societies developed to manage cattle herds and coordinate seasonal movements. The fifth catastrophe brought fire and sword together with failed harvests. Approximately 4,200 years ago, a mega-drought descended upon the interconnected civilizations of the Bronze Age world. This event, recognised by the International Commission on Stratigraphy as significant enough to define the beginning of the Megalayan stage within the Holocene epoch, coincided with and likely contributed to the collapse of multiple state-level societies across a broad geographic range. The Akkadian Empire, established by Sargon of Akkad around 2054 BCE as arguably the world's first true empire, disintegrated within decades of the drought's onset. Archaeological excavations at Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria, conducted by Harvey Weiss of Yale University beginning in 1978, documented the abrupt abandonment of this major urban centre around 2070 BCE. Soil analysis revealed a dramatic increase in wind-blown dust and a cessation of agriculture coinciding with this abandonment. The city, which had been the centre of a densely populated agricultural region, was essentially deserted for 300 years. The physical evidence extends across Mesopotamia. Archaeological surveys have documented the abandonment of settlements throughout the rain-fed agricultural zone of northern Syria and Iraq during this period. A defensive wall, the Repeller of the Amorites, was constructed across central Mesopotamia to stem the influx of pastoral nomads, climate refugees, displaced by the failure of marginal grazing lands. The Gutian invasion, recorded in Sumerian texts as a time of chaos when brigands occupied the highways and small birds swooped on the ground in great flocks, marks the political collapse that followed environmental catastrophe. Egypt experienced the same drought simultaneously, though its manifestations differed. The Old Kingdom, which had constructed the Great Pyramids at Giza, collapsed around 2150 BCE as repeated failures of the Nile flood undermined the economic and political foundations of the centralized state. Egyptian texts from this period, preserved on papyrus and stone, describe famine conditions, civil strife and the breakdown of social order. The autobiography of Ankh-Tifi, a provincial governor whose decorated tomb at El Mu'alla was discovered by French archaeologists in the 1920s, contains one of the most vivid accounts of the famine. The whole of Upper Egypt died of hunger, and each individual had reached such a state of hunger that he ate his own children. While such statements should be read with caution, Ankh-Tifi was clearly aggrandizing his own role as a provider of food. Multiple contemporary sources attest to severe hardship during this period. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the great urban cultures of the 3rd millennium BCE, declined dramatically during this same period. The major cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, which at their peak had housed populations of tens of thousands living in planned urban environments with sophisticated water management systems, were progressively abandoned. The population shifted eastward toward the Ganges Plain, where more reliable monsoon rainfall supported continued agricultural production. Even in China, the Longshan culture of the Yellow River Valley and the Liangzhu culture of the Yangtze Delta show evidence of disruption during this period. The Liangzhu, which had developed sophisticated jade-working traditions and constructed some of the earliest large-scale water management systems in East Asia, collapsed around 2300 BCE. Slightly earlier than the 4.2 kiloyear drought that affected the Near East. Research published in Science Advances in 2021 by Haiwei Zhang and colleagues, analysing stalagmites from caves in southeastern China, demonstrated that the Liangzhu collapse coincided with a period of exceptionally heavy monsoon rainfall between approximately 4345 and 4324 years ago. The massive flooding overwhelmed even the sophisticated hydraulic infrastructure the Liangzhu had constructed, forcing the abandonment of their urban centre. While this event preceded the Mediterranean drought by about a century, it illustrates how climate instability manifested differently. Across regions, excessive rainfall in one area, catastrophic drought in another. During this period of global climatic volatility, research published in Geology by Tsuyoshi Watanabe and colleagues in 2019, analysing fossil corals from Oman, provides direct evidence for the climate mechanism underlying these widespread collapses. Prolonged winter chamal wind seasons, producing dust storms and reducing precipitation across the Fertile Crescent, would have salinized irrigated fields and reduced crop yields precisely in the regions where the great Bronze Age civilizations had flourished. The fifth civilization, represented by the interconnected Bronze Age world, was not destroyed by a single catastrophe but by cascading failures. Drought triggering famine, famine triggering migration, migration triggering conflict, conflict triggering collapse. The pattern is familiar from later history. Climate stress strains the productive capacity of complex societies, weakening them until relatively minor additional pressures trigger systemic breakdown. Those who survived did so by retreating to smaller, more resilient communities, by shifting to pastoral nomadism that could follow available resources, or by moving to areas where environmental conditions remained favourable. The Akkadian Empire represents a remarkable achievement in early state formation. Sargon of Akkad, who rose from obscure origins to conquer the city-states of Sumer and establish control over territories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, created a political entity unprecedented in scale and organizational complexity. The administrative systems developed under Akkadian rule, standardized weights and measures, bureaucratic record-keeping, provincial governance structures, would influence subsequent Mesopotamian polities for millennia. At its height, the Akkadian Empire integrated diverse ecological zones into a single economic system, the rain-fed agricultural lands of northern Mesopotamia, where wheat and barley could be grown without irrigation, complemented the irrigated fields of the southern alluvium. Trade routes connected Akkadian territory to sources of timber in the mountains of modern-day Lebanon and Turkey, metals from Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, precious stones from Afghanistan and the Indus Valley. This integration created both efficiency and vulnerability. Efficiency because resources could flow from areas of surplus to areas of deficit. Vulnerability because disruption in one part of the system could propagate throughout. The evidence for climatic disruption during the late 3rd millennium BCE has accumulated through multiple independent lines of investigation. Marine sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman, analysed by Peter Domenical and colleagues at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, show marked increases in dust flux corresponding to increased wind erosion from desiccated landscapes. Speleothem records from caves in Israel and Oman document isotopic signatures consistent with reduced precipitation. Tree ring chronologies from Anatolia reveal growth patterns indicative of prolonged drought. The archaeological evidence from Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria provides the most detailed picture of what this drought meant for human populations. The site, excavated by Harvey Weiss beginning in 1978, was a major urban centre covering 90 hectares at its peak, one of the largest cities in the ancient Near East. Its population may have reached 20,000 inhabitants, making it comparable in size to many medieval European cities. The city served as a regional administrative centre under Akkadian rule, with monumental architecture, specialised craft production, and extensive grain storage facilities. Around 2200 BCE, Tel Leilan was abruptly abandoned. The archaeological evidence shows no signs of destruction by conquest, no burned buildings, no scattered weapons, no bodies left unburied. Instead, the city was simply emptied. Layers of wind-blown dust accumulated in streets and buildings that had been meticulously maintained just years earlier. The grain stores that had supported the city's population stood empty. Whatever catastrophe befell Tel Leilan, it was not military but environmental. Weiss's analysis of soil samples from the abandonment layers revealed dramatically increased dust concentrations, evidence of wind erosion from lands that had previously supported vegetation cover. The dust accumulation continued for 300 years, indicating not a brief drought, but a sustained climate shift that made the region uninhabitable for the agricultural populations who had called it home. The human cost of this transformation can only be estimated. Weiss has suggested that as many as 300,000 people may have been displaced from the rain-fed agricultural zone of northern Mesopotamia during the 4.2 kiloyear drought. These climate refugees streamed southward into the irrigated lands of southern Mesopotamia, creating demographic pressures that destabilized existing political structures. The Akkadian administration, unable to provide for massively expanded populations while simultaneously losing revenue from abandoned northern territories, collapsed. The Gutian invasion that followed represented not a conquest by powerful outsiders, but rather the opportunistic exploitation of a collapsed state by the marginal populations who had previously been contained by Akkadian military power. The Gutians, described in Sumerian texts as mountain dwellers with canine feelings and monkey features, may have been pastoral populations from the Zagros Mountains, who themselves were under pressure from climate change affecting highland pastures. Similar patterns played out across the ancient Near East. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, which had constructed the Great Pyramids of Giza, collapsed around 2050 BCE amid evidence of repeated Nile flood failures. Egyptian texts from this period describe famine, civil strife, and the breakdown of centralized authority. The Indus Valley civilization, centered on the great cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, began a progressive decline that would see those cities abandoned by 1900 BCE. In China, the Longshan culture of the Yellow River Valley and the Liangzhu culture of the Yangtze Delta both show evidence of disruption during this period. The interconnection of these civilizations through trade networks meant that collapse in one region propagated to others. Bronze production, which required tin from distant sources, possibly as far as Afghanistan or even Britain, became impossible when the trade routes were disrupted. Luxury goods that had circulated among elites stopped moving. The economic foundations of complex society crumbled as the exchange systems that supported specialized production broke down. The recovery from this catastrophe required centuries. The Ur-3 period, beginning around 212 BCE, saw the emergence of a Neo-Sumerian state that would briefly reunify much of Mesopotamia under centralized control. But the northern agricultural lands remained largely abandoned until around 1900 BCE, when wetter conditions finally returned and populations began resettling previously deserted territories. The 300-year gap between collapse and recovery represents something close to civilizational reset in a region that had been continuously settled for millennia. The sixth catastrophe remains the most mysterious. Genetic analysis of modern human populations, conducted by researchers at institutions including Stanford University, the University of Cambridge, and the Estonian Biocentre, has revealed a remarkable pattern. Approximately 5,000 to 1,000 years ago, the diversity of Y-chromosome lineages, genetic markers passed from father to son, collapsed dramatically across Africa, Europe, and Asia. This bottleneck was not observed in mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to child, suggesting that whatever caused it disproportionately affected the transmission of male genetic lineages. The magnitude of this genetic signal is extraordinary. Statistical analysis published in Genome Research by the Monica Carmin and colleagues in 2015 suggests that male effective population size dropped to levels implying approximately 1 reproducing male for every 17 reproducing females. This ratio, if interpreted literally, would suggest a catastrophic reduction in the number of male lineages being passed on across multiple continents, a pattern with few, if any, parallels in human genetic history. However, as subsequent research has clarified, this ratio reflects effective population sizes calculated from genetic diversity, not necessarily a literal 17-to-1 ratio of living women to men. Initial interpretations attributed this bottleneck to warfare between patrilineal clans, with successful groups eliminating rival lineages and absorbing their women into the victorious population. Research by Tianchen Zheng and colleagues at Stanford, published in Nature Communications in 2018, demonstrated through computational modelling that competition between patrilineal groups could indeed produce the observed genetic pattern without requiring an actual 17-to-1 ratio of females to males in the living population. However, alternative explanations have been proposed and continue to be refined. A study published in Nature Communications in 2024 by Laurent Guyon and colleagues suggests that patrilineal social organisation combined with patterns of group fission, the splitting of clans into new lineages, could produce similar genetic signatures without requiring either violent competition or extreme reproductive inequality. Under this model, the Y-chromosome bottleneck reflects not mass casualties or reproductive monopoly, but rather the operation of social structures that, through neutral demographic processes, naturally concentrated Y-chromosome diversity into fewer lineages over time. This interpretation offers a potentially more peaceful explanation for a genetic pattern that has puzzled researchers since its discovery. Whatever its ultimate cause, the Y-chromosome bottleneck marks a profound transformation in human social organisation. It coincides with the spread of patrilineal, pastoral societies across Eurasia, populations whose descendants would eventually establish the Indo-European Semitic and Sino-Tibetan language families that dominate the modern world. Whether through violence, disease, social reorganization, or some combination of these factors, the populations that existed before this transition were largely replaced by those that emerged from it. Some researchers have proposed pandemic disease as a contributing factor. The Neolithic transition, the shift from hunting and gathering to agricultural food production, brought humans into sustained close contact with domesticated animals, creating opportunities for zoonotic disease transmission. Tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, and other epidemic diseases that would devastate human populations in later historical periods may have had antecedents in this era. Dense Neolithic settlements, with their accumulated organic waste and concentrated populations, would have provided ideal conditions for disease amplification and spread. The sixth civilization, under this interpretation, may have been transformed by a silent process, either the violent competition of patrilineal clans, the concentration of reproductive success among elites, or the natural operation of kinship structures that, over generations, channeled Y-chromosome diversity into increasingly narrow lineages. The survivors, those whose male line ancestors happened to be among the lineages that persisted, would have been those with social or biological advantages in a rapidly changing world. And from these survivors, the civilizations that we recognize as ancient history, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus, early China, would emerge. The genetic evidence for a catastrophic population disruption during this period, though, has only become visible through advances in ancient DNA analysis and computational population genetics over the past decade. Traditional archaeology, focused on material culture and settlement patterns, had documented the emergence of new cultural traditions in the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE without recognizing the demographic upheaval that accompanied them. The Y-chromosome bottleneck reveals that this transition was far more dramatic than the archaeological record alone would suggest. The implications of a 17-to-1 female-to-male ratio, even if this figure represents effective population sizes rather than actual living individuals, are profound. Such extreme sex ratio distortion could only arise through processes that disproportionately eliminated male lineages, while leaving female lineages intact or even expanding. The hypotheses proposed to explain this pattern, clan warfare, reproductive monopoly by elite males, or social structures that concentrated reproductive success, all have significant implications for understanding the societies that existed during this period. The clan warfare hypothesis, developed by Tianchen Zheng and colleagues at Stanford University, proposes that patrilineal clan structures, social organizations in which men remain with their natal groups while women marry out, created conditions for Y-chromosome diversity loss through violent competition. In such systems, all men within a given clan carry essentially identical Y-chromosomes, having inherited them from a common male ancestor. When warfare eliminates entire clans, it simultaneously eliminates their Y-chromosome lineages. Women captured or absorbed from defeated clans would bring mitochondrial diversity into victorious groups while contributing nothing to Y-chromosome diversity. Computer simulations conducted by the Stanford team demonstrated that this mechanism could indeed produce Y-chromosome diversity loss of the magnitude observed in the genetic record. The key requirements were patrilineal clan structure, significant intergroup violence, and the absorption of female members of defeated groups into victorious populations. All of these conditions appear to have been present during the Neolithic to Bronze Age transition in many parts of Eurasia. Alternative hypotheses focus on social stratification rather than warfare. In highly unequal societies, reproductive success may be concentrated among a small number of elite males, while the majority of men leave few or no descendants. Historical examples of this phenomenon are well documented. Genghis Khan, according to genetic analysis published in the American Journal of Gore. Human genetics in 2003 may have been the direct male line ancestor of approximately 8% of men living in the former Mongol Empire, roughly 16 million individuals. Other historical lineages showing evidence of extreme reproductive success include the Uí Néill dynasty of medieval Ireland and various Chinese imperial lineages. If similar patterns of reproductive monopoly characterized early Bronze Age societies, they could have contributed to the Y-chromosome bottleneck without requiring mass casualty events. Elite males, commanding disproportionate access to resources and reproductive partners, could have swamped the Y-chromosome pool over multiple generations while non-elite male lineages died out through failure to reproduce. This mechanism would leave fewer archaeological traces than warfare, no mass graves, no destroyed settlements, but could produce equivalent genetic signatures. The most recent research, published in Nature Communications in 2024, proposes that both mechanisms are unnecessary to explain the observed pattern. Laurent Guyon and colleagues demonstrate through simulation that patrilineal social organization combined with group fission, the splitting of clans into daughter lineages when they grow too large, can produce Y-chromosome diversity loss even without significant warfare or reproductive inequality. The key insight is that patrilineal organization accelerates genetic drift, causing random fluctuations in lineage frequencies that over time eliminate diversity more rapidly than in bilateral descent systems. Whatever the precise mechanism, the Y-chromosome bottleneck marks a fundamental transformation in human social organization. The populations that emerged from this bottleneck were organized differently, related differently to territory and resources, and transmitted identity and inheritance differently than their predecessors. The transition from the relatively egalitarian societies documented archaeologically in the Neolithic to the stratified kingdoms and empires of the Bronze Age was accompanied by and perhaps caused by a genetic revolution that reshaped the human population of Eurasia. The period immediately following the bottleneck saw the emergence of the first historically attested civilizations. Sumerian city-states developed writing, monumental architecture, and complex administrative systems in the early 3rd millennium BC. Egyptian civilization unified under the first pharaohs around 3100 BCE. The Indus Valley civilization reached its urban peak between 2600 and 1900 BCE. Chinese Bronze Age cultures emerged along the Yellow River during the same period. These civilizations, the oldest for which we have written records and monumental remains, arose from the demographic foundations laid during the Y-chromosome bottleneck period. The relationship between the genetic transformation and civilizational emergence may not be coincidental. The social structures that produced the Y-chromosome bottleneck, whether through warfare, reproductive stratification, or kinship organization, may have been precisely the structures that enabled the mobilization of labor for monumental construction, the accumulation of surplus for elite consumption, and the administrative coordination of complex societies. The same patterns that concentrated Y-chromosome diversity in successful lineages may have concentrated power, wealth, and organizational capacity in ways that made civilization possible. We are the seventh. This framing that we are the seventh civilization may seem provocative, even sensational, yet when the evidence is examined systematically, a pattern of significant environmental disruptions coinciding with major cultural transitions becomes difficult to dismiss entirely. The Younger Dryas climatic disruption and the contested impact hypothesis, the post-glacial sea level rise, the 8.2 kiloyear climate crisis, the Saharan desiccation beginning around 500 years ago, the 4.2 kiloyear drought that coincided with Bronze Age disruptions, and the Neolithic Y-chromosome bottleneck each mark moments when the trajectory of human civilizational development appears to have shifted significantly. Whether these disruptions destroyed civilizations in any meaningful sense, or whether they simply accelerated cultural changes that were already underway, remains a matter of scholarly interpretation. Remarkably, this pattern of multiple world ages, each ending in destruction, appears in the mythological traditions of cultures across the globe. The Hindu concept of manvantaras, cosmic ages each presided over by a different Manu, or progenitor of humanity, posits that we are currently living in the seventh such period, under the governance of Vaivasvata Manu, who survived a great flood through divine intervention. The Puranic texts describe 14 manvantaras within each kalpa, or day of Brahma, with each transition marked by devastation and renewal. The Hopi of the American Southwest maintain traditions of 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by the different catastrophes, fire, ice, flood and upheaval, before the emergence into the current 5th world. The Aztec legend of the 5 suns describes 4 previous ages ended respectively by jaguars, hurricanes, fire and flood, with the current 5th sun destined to end in earthquakes. Norse mythology speaks of a cycle of creation and destruction that extends indefinitely into past and future, with the current world having risen from the destruction of a previous age and destined eventually for Ragnarok and subsequent rebirth. These mythological parallels do not prove that ancient peoples possessed literal knowledge of prehistoric catastrophes. They may instead reflect universal patterns in human psychological responses to disaster, the natural tendency to organize experience into cyclical patterns, or the influence of common ancestral mythological traditions that spread through cultural diffusion. Yet the specificity with which many traditions enumerate the number of previous ages and the thematic similarities in the types of destruction described has led some researchers to suggest that these myths may preserve at least distorted memories of actual historical experiences, though this interpretation remains speculative and contested. The Sumerian king list, one of the earliest written historical documents, explicitly acknowledges a great flood that divided human history into antediluvian and post-diluvian periods. The kings before the flood are listed as ruling for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years in the most common versions. After the flood, regnal lengths drop to merely implausible levels, then gradually decline toward historically reasonable numbers as the list approaches periods for which independent verification becomes possible. Scholars have interpreted these impossibly long pre-flood reigns in various ways. Some suggest they represent dynasties rather than individuals. Others propose mathematical or astronomical coding. Still others dismiss them as purely mythological invention. Yet one interpretation that merits consideration is that the pre-flood kings represent a different way of measuring time, perhaps based on astronomical cycles, perhaps reflecting the compressed perception of deep time among peoples lacking written records, perhaps encoding genuine memories of a civilizational predecessor that existed before the catastrophe the Sumerians remembered as the flood. What destroyed the civilizations that preceded us, and what does this imply for our own future? The first lesson from this examination of civilizational catastrophe is that existential threats come in multiple forms. Cosmic impacts, sea level changes, climate disruption, environmental transformation, and pandemic disease have each played roles in resetting the trajectory of human development. A civilization that prepares only for repetitions of past catastrophes may be blindsided by threats from entirely different directions. The second lesson is that interconnection breeds fragility. The Bronze Age collapse affected multiple civilizations simultaneously, not merely because they shared a common climate, but because they were linked through trade networks, diplomatic relationships, and mutual dependencies that amplified local stresses into systemic crises. When one region failed, the effects propagated through the network, destabilizing partners who might otherwise have survived. Modern civilization, vastly more interconnected than any Bronze Age trade network, may be correspondingly more vulnerable to cascading failures. The third lesson is that knowledge can be preserved across catastrophe, but only with deliberate effort. The builders of Göbekli Tepe encoded astronomical information in stone that has survived 11,000 years. The survivors of the Saharan desiccation carried astronomical and pastoral knowledge to the Nile Valley, where it contributed to the emergence of Egyptian civilization. The flood myths that pervade global cultures may represent the fading echo of genuine memories passed down across hundreds of generations. Yet in each case much more was lost than was preserved. The mathematical systems, the technological knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of destroyed civilizations largely perished with them, leaving their successors to reinvent what had been lost. Our own civilization possesses knowledge, preservation capabilities unprecedented in human history. The Long Now Foundation's Rosetta project aims to create archives that could survive and remain comprehensible for millennia. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault preserves the genetic heritage of agricultural crops against potential future catastrophe. The Internet Archive works to preserve the digital record of our civilization against technological obsolescence and social disruption. Yet our most critical knowledge is increasingly stored in formats that require complex technological infrastructure to access, infrastructure that might not survive a serious civilizational disruption. The fourth lesson is that survival after catastrophe requires adaptation. The populations that persisted through each of the 6 destructions were those capable of changing their ways of life to match changed circumstances. Hunter-gatherers became farmers. Farmers became pastoralists. Coastal peoples moved inland. Desert peoples sought out rivers. Flexibility, not commitment to traditional ways, determined which populations carried their genetic and cultural heritage into subsequent ages. Our civilization is characterized by extraordinary technological capability, but also by extraordinary dependence on continuous functioning of complex systems. Modern agriculture depends on fossil fuel inputs, global supply chains for seeds and fertilizers, and climate patterns that appear increasingly unstable. Modern medicine depends on pharmaceutical supply chains, electronic record systems, and trained personnel whose expertise cannot be quickly replaced. Modern communication depends on orbiting satellites, undersea cables, and electronic infrastructure vulnerable to both natural and deliberate disruption. The fifth lesson is that the interval between catastrophes is measured in millennia, not years or decades. The events that destroyed previous civilizations were separated by thousands of years. This timescale exceeds the planning horizons of modern institutions, which typically optimize for returns within years or decades and discount the future at rates that make millennia-distant threats essentially invisible. Democratic political systems rarely maintain consistent policy commitments for more than a few electoral cycles. Corporate planning horizons extend to quarterly reports and 5-year strategic plans. Even the longest-term infrastructure projects, nuclear waste repositories, for example, are designed for timescales of 10,000 years, roughly matching the interval between major civilizational catastrophes. Yet this timescale is exactly what the evidence suggests we should be planning for. Cosmic impact events occur at intervals of thousands to tens of thousands of years. Major climate state changes triggered by volcanic eruptions, ocean circulation disruptions, or other geophysical processes occur on similar timescales. Even pandemic diseases, while occurring more frequently, can produce civilizational scale impacts only when they encounter populations lacking immunity, a condition that typically requires centuries to develop. The mythological traditions that speak of multiple world ages typically assign each destroyed civilization a specific type of ending: fire, water, wind, plague, war, earthquake. The pattern suggests that ancient peoples recognized what modern risk analysts would call multi-hazard vulnerability, the understanding that civilization can be destroyed in many different ways and that survival requires preparation for diverse threats. The seventh civilization, our civilization, faces all the categories of threat that destroyed its predecessors, plus additional hazards unknown to earlier ages. Climate change is already reshaping rainfall patterns, agricultural zones, and coastal geography in ways reminiscent of the Saharan desiccation. Pandemic disease, as demonstrated by recent events, retains the capacity to disrupt global systems despite centuries of medical progress. Asteroid impacts remain a statistical certainty on sufficiently long timescales, though modern technology, at least, offers the possibility of descent and deflection. Yet our civilization also faces threats that previous civilizations never encountered. Nuclear weapons have given us the capacity to cause our own extinction, a possibility that existed for none of our predecessors. Artificial intelligence systems of increasing capability are being developed without clear understanding of how to ensure their values remain aligned with human welfare. Biotechnology makes possible the deliberate or accidental creation of engineered pathogens more deadly than any natural disease. Climate change, though accelerated by human activity, may push Earth systems past tipping points that trigger changes more rapid and severe than the natural variations that disrupted previous civilizations. In this light, the question of whether we are the seventh civilization becomes more than merely academic. If the pattern of civilizational rise and fall is real, understanding what destroyed our predecessors becomes essential to avoiding their fate. If the pattern is illusory, a product of confirmation bias, coincidental dating, and overinterpretation of fragmentary evidence, then we may face a future less constrained by precedent, but also less informed by example. The evidence assembled here suggests that the pattern of cyclical disruption, while not conclusively proven, merits serious consideration. Major environmental events have punctuated human prehistory at intervals of roughly 1,000 to 2,000 years. Each event coincided with significant discontinuities in the archaeological record, changes in material culture, settlement patterns, and subsistence strategies that suggest major cultural transformations, whether through population replacement, adaptation under stress, or some combination of factors. Mythological traditions across multiple cultures preserve narratives of destruction and renewal that, while filtered through millennia of oral transmission and cultural interpretation, show structural similarities that may or may not reflect actual historical events. The interpretation of this evidence remains the subject of ongoing scholarly debate. The stratigraphy of Ur, where Leonard Woolley found his flood layers, continues downward beneath the oldest Sumerian remains. Beneath the flood deposits, beneath the pottery of pre-flood peoples, there are deeper layers yet unexcavated, sediments laid down in times of which we have no written record and only fragmentary archaeological evidence. What destroyed the peoples who lived in those depths? What catastrophes preceded even the oldest that Sumerian tradition remembered? The archaeological record, even in regions as thoroughly studied as Mesopotamia, becomes increasingly fragmentary as we look deeper into the past. Sites that might preserve evidence of earlier civilizations lie buried beneath meters of accumulated sediment, drowned beneath risen seas, or destroyed by the very catastrophes whose evidence we seek. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, yet neither can we conjure knowledge from materials that have not survived for our examination. What we can say with some confidence is that the human species has survived multiple events of civilizational disruption. Our ancestors, whoever they were and however they lived, passed through fires, literal and metaphorical, that should have extinguished their lineages. They found water when droughts gripped their lands. They fled advancing seas and found new homes on higher ground. They adapted to climate changes that transformed their environments beyond recognition. They survived plagues that decimated their numbers and rebuilt populations from reduced foundations. This resilience is cause for hope, but not for complacency. Each catastrophe that humanity survived also destroyed much that was precious: accumulated knowledge, cultural traditions, the lives of countless individuals who had no opportunity to escape what befell them. Survival at the species level is compatible with unimaginable suffering at the individual and community level. The goal should not merely be to survive as a species, but to preserve what we have achieved, to maintain the capabilities we have developed, to avoid the loss of centuries of accumulated progress that characterized each previous civilizational reset. The seventh civilization has advantages none of its predecessors possessed. We understand, as they could not, the mechanisms by which catastrophes occur. We have developed technologies that could, if properly deployed, provide warning of and possibly protection against at least some existential threats. We have created knowledge preservation systems capable, at least in principle, of surviving disruptions that would destroy less robust information storage media. We have constructed global communication networks that could coordinate responses to threats across distances and cultural boundaries that previous civilizations could not bridge. Whether we will use these advantages wisely remains to be seen. The evidence of the past offers both warning and encouragement. Warning because civilizations possessed of sophisticated knowledge and impressive achievements have failed before, and we should not assume ourselves immune to the forces that destroyed them. Encouragement because some portion of humanity has survived every catastrophe that the past 12,000 years have delivered, and there is no reason in principle why our descendants cannot number among the survivors of whatever the future holds. The Sumerian king list ends with a phrase that has echoed through millennia of subsequent human history. Then kingship was taken to Isin. The seat of civilization moved, as it always had, to wherever conditions permitted its continuation. The specifics changed, the language, the gods, the forms of governance and social organization, but the thread of human cultural continuity extended onward. The global shabuyo, distribution of myths describing multiple world ages, deserves careful examination, for it suggests that cultural memories of civilizational catastrophe may be more widespread and more persistent than conventional scholarship has assumed. In Hindu cosmology, the present age represents just one moment in an infinite cycle of cosmic creation and destruction. The current Kali Yuga, or Iron Age, is the last and most degraded of 4 yugas that constitute a single Mahayuga. 71 Mahayugas constitute a single Manvantara presided over by a Manu, a progenitor figure analogous to the biblical Adam or the Mesopotamian first man. The present Manvantara is the 7th, governed by Vaivasvata Manu, who is remembered in Hindu tradition as the survivor of a great flood. The parallels between the Hindu Vaivasvata Manu and the Mesopotamian flood heroes Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, and the biblical Noah are remarkable. In each tradition, a wise man is warned by divine beings of an impending deluge. He constructs a vessel to preserve his family and the seeds of living things. After the waters recede, he emerges to repopulate a cleansed world. The specifics differ. The Hindu version emphasizes Manu's rescue by the fish avatar of Vishnu, while the Mesopotamian versions feature human-built arks and divine councils, but the core narrative structure remains consistent. This structural consistency has been explained in various ways. Diffusionist theories propose that the flood myth originated in a single source culture, usually identified with Mesopotamia, and spread through cultural contact to other regions. Psychological theories suggest that flood myths represent universal human responses to the experience of flooding, which has affected communities throughout history. Jungian theories identify the flood as an archetypal symbol of transformation and renewal embedded in the collective unconscious. Yet another possibility deserves consideration: that flood myths preserve genuine, if distorted, memories of actual historical flooding events. The post-glacial sea level rise was a global phenomenon that affected every inhabited coastline on Earth. The meltwater pulses that punctuated this rise were rapid enough to have been perceptible within human lifetimes, and dramatic enough to have left lasting impressions on affected communities. If flood myths represent cultural memories of these events, their global distribution is exactly what we would expect. The Hopi traditions of the American Southwest provide a particularly detailed account of multiple world ages. According to Hopi cosmology, the present world is the fourth world, or fifth in some tellings, preceded by 3 or 4 previous worlds that were destroyed through various catastrophes. The first world, called Tokpela, was destroyed by fire. The second world, Tokpa, was destroyed by ice. The third world, Kuskurza, was destroyed by water. In each case, righteous individuals were guided to safety by spiritual Tedsen, beings emerging from the destroyed world to populate the new one. The Hopi emergence myth describes the survivors of the third world's destruction travelling by boat from island to island until they reached the American Southwest. This narrative has been interpreted variously as mythological invention, as distorted memory of pre-Columbian Pacific navigation, or as cultural memory of continental migration from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge. Each interpretation has supporters and detractors, and the evidence does not permit definitive resolution. What is clear is that the Hopi, like peoples across the world, preserve traditions of multiple world ages and catastrophic transitions between them. The Aztec legend of the 5 suns provides perhaps the most detailed Mesoamerican account of cyclical creation and destruction. According to this tradition, preserved in documents including the Codex Chimalpopoca and the Leyenda de los Soles, the present world is the 5th sun, preceded by 4 previous suns that ended in catastrophe. The first sun, Nahui Ocelotl, 4 Jaguar, was destroyed when jaguars devoured the giant inhabitants of that age. The second sun, Nahui Ehikatl, 4 Wind, was destroyed by hurricane winds that transformed the inhabitants into monkeys. The third sun, Nahui Queahuitl, 4 Rain, was destroyed by a rain of fire. The fourth sun, Nahui Atl, 4 Water, was destroyed by a flood that transformed the inhabitants into fish. The 5th sun, according to Aztec belief, was created through divine sacrifice at the ancient city of Teotihuacan, where the gods Nanahuatzin and Tecuxtecatl threw themselves into a ceremonial fire to become the sun and moon. This sun, Nahui Olin, 4 Movement, is sustained by human blood sacrifice and will eventually be destroyed by earthquakes. The Aztec practice of human sacrifice was thus understood not as cruelty, but as cosmic necessity, the only means of preventing the premature end of the current world age. Norse mythology similarly describes cycles of creation and destruction extending into indefinite past and future. The present world emerged from the body of the primordial giant Ymir, slain by the gods Odin, Vili, and Ve. It will end in Ragnarok, a final battle between gods and giants in which most of the divine and human inhabitants of the 9 worlds will perish. Yet Ragnarok is not a final end. The Völuspá, the prophetic poem that describes these events, concludes with the emergence of a renewed world from the waters that engulf the old, populated by surviving gods and the descendants of 2 humans who took refuge in the world tree Yggdrasil. Chinese traditions, while less explicitly cyclical than their South Asian counterparts, also preserve accounts of catastrophic floods and civilizational founders who appeared in their aftermath. The legendary Yu the Great, founder of the Xia dynasty, is remembered primarily for his successful control of the floodwaters that had devastated China, a feat that required 13 years of effort and established the hydraulic engineering tradition that would characterize Chinese civilization for millennia. The chaos before Yu's intervention is described in terms suggesting not merely seasonal flooding but civilizational collapse, populations scattered, agricultural production disrupted, social order dissolved. The consistency of these traditions across culturally and geographically distinct peoples raises important questions about the nature of human cultural memory. At minimum, it suggests that memories of catastrophic disruption can persist across extraordinarily long time spans, encoded in mythological frameworks that preserve core narrative elements while allowing details to vary according to local conditions and cultural values. At maximum, it suggests that the human experience of civilizational catastrophe is sufficiently universal and sufficiently traumatic to generate independently similar narrative responses in populations that had no contact with one another. That thread extends now to us. We are its current bearers, the latest inheritors of a legacy that passes back through ages of which we have only fragmentary knowledge, through catastrophes whose details we can only partially reconstruct, through civilizations whose achievements and failures we can only dimly perceive. What we do with this inheritance, whether we preserve it and pass it forward enriched or squander it and leave our descendants impoverished, is the choice that confronts each generation. The seventh civilization has recognized, as perhaps none of its predecessors could, that it is merely one iteration in a longer sequence. This recognition carries responsibility. Understanding that others came before us, that they too built and achieved and were ultimately destroyed, should cultivate humility about our own permanence while also inspiring determination to prove different. The past teaches that survival is possible. The past also teaches that survival is not guaranteed. The night, sky that our ancestors watched for signs and portents still arches above us, indifferent to human ambitions yet full of information for those with eyes to read it. The climate systems that brought drought and flood to previous civilizations still cycle through their patterns, perhaps now disrupted by human activity into configurations without precedent in the period of human civilization. The microbes that decimated earlier populations still evolve, acquiring new capabilities, probing the defences of new hosts. The tectonic plates, whose movements have reshaped continents and obliterated coastlines, continue their slow dance beneath our feet. We are the seventh civilization, or so this framework suggests. Whether this categorization reflects genuine historical patterns or represents an interpretive framework imposed on fragmentary evidence remains a matter for ongoing research and debate. The 6 events that preceded our current age, if they destroyed civilizations in any meaningful sense, rose, transformed and gave way to new cultural configurations. Their monuments, where they survive, crumble in deserts that may once have been more hospitable. Their settlements lie buried beneath sediments or drowned beneath seas. Their knowledge survives only in fragments, in myths whose original meanings may have been transformed beyond recognition, in genes that testify to population changes and migrations, in stone circles and monuments whose builders' names and purposes have been lost to time. What will our descendants say of us 10,000 years hence? Will they remember us as the civilization that finally broke the cycle, that recognized the patterns of destruction and built systems capable of weathering them? Or will they excavate our ruins, as we excavate Çatalhöyük and Mohenjo-Daro, piecing together fragments of a way of life that failed in the face of challenges its builders could not overcome? The answer to that question is not written in any prophecy or encoded in any myth. It is being written now in the choices we make and the systems we build, in the knowledge we preserve and the wisdom we apply to the challenges before us. We are the seventh civilization. What happens to us depends on whether we prove capable of learning from the fate of the 6 that came before. The archaeological excavations continue. Each season brings new discoveries from sites across the ancient Near East, Central Asia, the Mediterranean, the Americas, and increasingly from the seabeds of the world's continental shelves. Technologies for remote sensing, DNA analysis, isotopic dating, and materials characterization grow more powerful with each passing year. The fragments of knowledge that previous civilizations left behind are being assembled with unprecedented precision into an increasingly coherent picture of human prehistory. What emerges from this picture is humbling. We are not the first humans to build cities, to develop writing, to create art of transcendent beauty, to observe the stars and derive meaning from their patterns. We are not the first to imagine ourselves the pinnacle of creation, the masters of nature, the final answer to whatever question the universe has posed. Others before us reached heights of achievement that we can only dimly perceive through the archaeological record, and they fell. Not because they were foolish or wicked, though they were doubtless both, as we are, but because the forces that shape human destiny operate on scales that dwarf individual intention and collective planning. The Younger Dryas impact event was not caused by human activity. The post-glacial sea level rise was not caused by human activity. The 8.2 kiloyear climate disruption was not caused by human activity. The orbital forcing that desiccated the Sahara operated on timescales and through mechanisms utterly beyond human control. Even the droughts that destroyed Bronze Age civilizations, though perhaps influenced by humans, landscape modification, were primarily driven by natural climate variability that no technology of that era could have predicted or prevented. Yet this is precisely where our situation differs most profoundly from those of our predecessors. For the first time in human history, we face catastrophic threats that are substantially of our own making. Climate change driven by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions threatens disruption potentially more severe than the natural climate variations that destroyed previous civilizations. Nuclear weapons give us the capacity to end civilization within hours, rather than the generations or centuries that natural catastrophes typically require. Engineered pathogens could potentially combine the transmissibility of natural diseases with lethality beyond anything evolution has produced. Artificial intelligence systems growing rapidly in capability could, if developed without adequate safeguards, pursue goals misaligned with human welfare on scales and at speeds that preclude human response. These novel threats compound rather than replace the natural hazards that destroyed our predecessors. Asteroid impacts remain statistically certain on sufficiently long time scales. Supervolcanic eruptions could produce climate effects exceeding anything in the historical record. Solar events of sufficient magnitude could disable the electronic infrastructure upon which modern civilization depends. The full range of natural catastrophes that punctuated human prehistory remains active, augmented now by anthropogenic hazards that previous civilizations never faced. The interconnection of modern civilization amplifies both its capabilities and its vulnerabilities. Global trade networks enable unprecedented efficiency in resource allocation, but create dependencies that can propagate local disruptions into systemic crises. Digital communication systems enable coordination across distances and cultural boundaries unimaginable to previous civilizations, but concentrate critical functions in infrastructure vulnerable to physical or cyber attack. Monoculture agriculture feeds billions, but exposes food supplies to pathogens and climate variations that more diverse systems could withstand. The survivors of previous catastrophes benefited from isolation and diversity. When one region collapsed, others could persist, preserving knowledge and eventually repopulating abandoned territories. The Ubaid people who appeared in Mesopotamia after the floods may have preserved traditions from submerged coastal civilizations. The populations who concentrated along rivers after the 8.2 kilo-year event carried knowledge from the abandoned rain-fed agricultural zones. The refugees who fled the desiccating Sahara brought astronomical and pastoral knowledge to the Nile Valley. In each case, civilizational continuity was maintained through geographic redundancy. The fact that catastrophe in one region did not necessarily mean catastrophe everywhere. Modern civilization lacks this redundancy. The same economic system, the same technological infrastructure, the same supply chains span the globe. Crisis severe enough to disrupt these systems in one region would likely disrupt them everywhere. The survivors of a modern civilizational collapse would not have unaffected regions from which to draw knowledge and resources, but would face a world in which all the systems upon which modern life depends had failed simultaneously. This vulnerability argues for deliberate efforts to create redundancy, distributed infrastructure, regional self-sufficiency, preserved knowledge in formats that do not require complex technology to access. The Long Now Foundation's projects, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the Internet Archive's physical and digital preservation efforts, represent steps in this direction. But they remain small-scale initiatives in a world that continues to optimize for efficiency over resilience, for short-term returns over long-term survival. The political obstacles to civilizational scale planning are formidable. Democratic systems select for leaders who promise benefits within electoral cycles, not those who propose sacrifices for generations unborn. Corporate governance optimizes for quarterly returns, not millennial survival. International institutions struggle to coordinate responses to threats that cross national boundaries and temporal horizons. The very success of modern civilization in providing unprecedented prosperity and security has created populations with little experience of catastrophe and correspondingly little motivation to prepare for it. Yet the evidence from previous civilizations suggests that preparation matters. The populations that survived the younger dryas impact were not randomly selected, but included those who happened to be in sheltered locations or who possessed skills useful in radically changed conditions. The populations that survived the Bronze Age collapse were those with access to reliable water sources, or the ability to adopt flexible subsistence strategies. The populations that emerged from the Y-chromosome bottleneck were those whose social organization conferred advantages in the competitive environment of the transitional period. Survival was not random. It was correlated with characteristics that, in principle, can be cultivated. What characteristics should our civilization cultivate to maximize its probability of survival? The evidence suggests several priorities. First, the preservation of knowledge in durable, accessible formats that could survive disruption of electronic infrastructure. Second, the maintenance of skills and technologies that do not depend on complex supply chains, basic agriculture, metallurgy, medicine, construction. Third, the development of social structures capable of coordinating response to crisis without depending on centralized authority that might itself be destroyed. Fourth, the psychological and cultural preparation for the possibility of civilizational disruption, not fatalistic resignation, but realistic assessment of risks and appropriate investment in mitigation. None of these preparations guarantee survival. The history of previous civilizations demonstrates that even sophisticated societies can be overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. But the same history demonstrates that survival is possible, that knowledge can be preserved across catastrophe, that the thread of human cultural continuity has never been completely severed, despite repeated near breaks. We are the descendants of survivors, people who faced fire from the sky, drowning seas, failed harvests, epidemic disease and civilizational collapse, and who nonetheless persisted to produce descendants who would eventually produce us. The Earth continues its slow rotation toward morning. The stars wheel overhead in patterns unchanged since the hunters of the Ice Age named the constellations. Somewhere beneath the sands of Iraq, beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, beneath the ice of Antarctica, evidence of our predecessors waits for future archaeologists to recover. And we, the latest inheritors of an uncertain legacy, face choices that will determine whether our works will join theirs in the silence of the archaeological record, or whether we will prove, against all precedent, to be the civilization that endured. The seventh civilization dreams on, uncertain of its waking. The layers of sediment continue to accumulate, each year adding its microscopic contribution to the geological record that future investigators will someday examine. The ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica continue to trap air bubbles and dust particles that record the composition of Earth's atmosphere with each passing season. The coral reefs continue to grow layer upon layer, encoding in their calcium carbonate skeletons the temperature and chemistry of surrounding waters. The genes of every human on Earth continue to carry their testimony of bottlenecks, and expansions, migrations, and catastrophes, a living archive of ancestry that reaches back through all the generations who came before. In archaeological sites across the globe, researchers continue their patient work of excavation and analysis. Each season brings new revelations from tells and tumuli, shell middens and cave deposits, submerged settlements and buried cities, the fragments of pottery and bone, the traces of hearth fires and foundation walls, the seeds and pollen grains preserved by chance through millennia, all contribute to an increasingly detailed picture of how our ancestors lived, what they achieved, and how their worlds ended. The picture that emerges is both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it demonstrates how limited our current perspective on human history remains. The civilizations we call ancient, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus, China, represent merely the latest chapter in a story that extends back 12,000 years and more into the Saharas, depths of prehistory. Before them came societies whose achievements we can only glimpse through monuments like Göbekli Tepe and traditions preserved in myths whose origins have been forgotten. Inspiring because it demonstrates the resilience of our species. 6 times, according to the framework we have traced, catastrophe has struck hard enough to reset the trajectory of human civilizational development. 6 times, survivors have carried fragments of accumulated knowledge into a new age and rebuilt. The thread of cultural continuity, though frayed by fire and flood and drought and plague and war, has never been completely severed. We are here because our ancestors persisted through trials that would have extinguished any species with lesser capacities for adaptation, cooperation, and cultural transmission. And somewhere, in excavation trenches not yet dug, in sediment cores not yet raised, in archives not yet analysed, the evidence of what we have been and what we might become waits. To tell its story to investigators we will never know. 6 major disruptions, 6 cultural transformations, the 7th age continues, and the choice, as always, remains ours.